The summer of 1981 was supposed to be filled with laughter and family picnics for the Smith family. Instead, it turned into a nightmare that has haunted them for decades. It was a sunny afternoon in a quiet town when three young triplets, identical brothers, barely 5 years old, vanished without a trace. No warning, no note, no sign of struggle. Just an empty park bench where they had been playing moments earlier, their tiny shoes still in the sandbox. Their mother, Margaret Smith, spent every waking moment searching for them. Flyers, police investigations, desperate phone calls, nothing brought her boys back. As the years stretched on, the town's whispers turned into solemn condolences. Most people believed the triplets had met a tragic fate, and the case eventually went cold. But Margaret never gave up hope. For 30 years, Margaret carried that heavy burden in her heart. Every birthday, she baked 3 cakes and set 3 empty chairs at the table. Every holiday, she hung 3 little stockings by the fireplace, refusing to accept that her children were gone forever. She knew in her soul that her boys were still out there somewhere, waiting for her to find them. She just didn't know how or where to look anymore. Then, in 2011, everything changed. Margaret, now a grandmother and living in a modest house on the edge of town, was going through boxes of old memories in her attic when she stumbled upon something that stopped her cold. Buried under stacks of dusty photo albums and faded baby clothes was a sealed envelope, yellowed with age but untouched since the day it was placed there. Her hands trembled as she opened it, her breath catching in her throat. Inside was a single Polaroid photo, slightly out of focus but unmistakable. 3 young boys, standing in front of a worn-out wooden sign that read, "Welcome to Redwood Creek." Their faces were older, different, but their eyes, those bright blue eyes, were the same. They were her triplets, she was sure of it. The date scribbled on the back of the photo said June 2001, 20 years after they had vanished. Margaret's heart raced. Where was Redwood Creek? How had the photo ended up in her attic? And why had someone hidden it from her for so long? Questions flooded her mind, but one thing was clear. This was proof that her boys had been alive long after she last saw them. It was a sign, maybe the first real sign she'd had in 30 years, and she couldn't ignore it. She took the photo to the local police station, her hands still shaking. But the detective on duty looked at her with weary eyes, like he'd heard too many similar stories over the years. He promised to reopen the case, but Margaret could tell he didn't really believe her. He thought she was a grieving mother grasping at straws. But Margaret knew better. She knew what she'd seen. Determined to uncover the truth, Margaret started her own investigation. She pored over maps, traced old phone books, and dug through newspapers for any mention of Redwood Creek. She even reached out to old friends and neighbors, hoping someone else might remember seeing her boys or hearing about the town in the photo. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, but Margaret wouldn't let go of that thin thread of hope. She finally found a mention of Redwood Creek in an old travel guide from the early 90s. It was a tiny logging town, tucked deep in the woods of Northern California. Practically forgotten, with barely 100 residents and no cell phone service even in 2011. The place had a reputation for being cut off from the rest of the world, like it was stuck in time. Margaret packed her bags the very next day, driven by the possibility that her boys might have lived there, or maybe still did. The journey to Redwood Creek was like stepping back in time. The roads grew narrower and the trees thicker, and soon she was surrounded by a forest so dense it swallowed up every sign of civilization. Her old car rattled and groaned as she wound her way through the twisting roads, the only sound the hum of the engine and the occasional chirp of birds. By the time she reached the town limits, the sun had dipped low in the sky, casting long shadows across the empty streets. The town itself was eerily quiet. Weathered wooden houses, a single gas station, and an old general store that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. Margaret parked her car and stepped out, clutching the photo like a talisman. She walked up to the first house she saw, her heart pounding in her chest. She knocked, but no one answered. She tried again at the general store, and finally an old man with a long beard and suspicious eyes cracked the door open. She showed him the photo, her voice trembling. "Have you seen these boys? They're my sons." The old man squinted at the photo, then back at her. He hesitated, like he wanted to say something but was holding back. Finally, he said, "You should leave, ma'am. Redwood Creek doesn't welcome strangers." But Margaret refused to leave. She spent the next few days wandering the dusty streets, showing the photo to anyone who would listen. Most people looked away, some muttered prayers under their breath, and others simply turned and walked in the opposite direction. It was like the whole town had decided to forget the past, to bury any memory of those missing boys. Just when Margaret was starting to lose hope, she met a woman named Ruth who ran the only diner in town. Ruth was kind, with warm eyes that seemed to hold 100 secrets. When Margaret showed her the photo, Ruth's face went pale. She closed the diner early that night and invited Margaret to sit with her in the back room. Over steaming cups of coffee, Ruth whispered what she knew. "I remember those boys," she said. "They came here years ago, out of nowhere. Nobody knew where they came from, and nobody asked. They were different, though. Quiet. Always looking over their shoulders." Ruth paused, glancing out the window like she was afraid of being overheard. One day, they just disappeared again. No one's seen them since. Margaret felt her world tilt. Her boys had been here. She was so close, yet they'd slipped away again like shadows. Before Ruth could say more, the bell above the diner door jingled and Ruth's face went stiff. "You need to leave town, Margaret," she said urgently. "Some things in Redwood Creek are best left alone." But Margaret couldn't leave, not now. She had come too far, and her boys were out there somewhere. She could feel it in her bones. That night, she lay in the motel room, the photo clutched to her chest, listening to the wind howl outside. She didn't know what secrets Redwood Creek was hiding, or who was trying so hard to keep them buried. All she knew was that she wouldn't stop until she found the truth. Little did she know, the real mystery was just beginning. And in the darkness of Redwood Creek, the past was about to come crashing back in ways she could never have imagined. Margaret didn't sleep much that night. She kept replaying Ruth's words in her mind, trying to piece together what had happened all those years ago. The motel room was small and smelled of mildew, but she barely noticed. She sat on the edge of the bed, the photo of her boys resting in her lap, and stared out the cracked window into the dark forest beyond. It felt like the trees were watching her, whispering secrets she couldn't quite hear. In the morning, she decided to pay Ruth another visit. The diner was already open, the warm smell of coffee and fresh biscuits drifting out into the street. Ruth was there, moving briskly behind the counter, but when she saw Margaret walk in, her face fell. She glanced around nervously before motioning for Margaret to sit in a booth at the back. Margaret didn't waste any time. "Ruth, please," she said softly. "I need to know what happened to my boys. Anything you can tell me, even if it's just a rumor, it might help me find them." Ruth hesitated, wiping her hands on her apron. She looked like she wanted to help but was scared of something, or someone. "They were good boys," she said finally. "Came here in the late 90s, maybe 98 or 99. Nobody asked too many questions. That's the way things are here. But they didn't belong. You could see it in their eyes. They never played with the other kids. They kept to themselves." Margaret leaned forward, her heart pounding. Did anyone know where they came from? Ruth shook her head. No. They lived with an old woman named Mrs. Carter up at the edge of town. She'd been here forever, kind of a recluse. People said she took them in like they were her own. But she was strange, Margaret. Always talking about spirits in the woods and old family curses. Most folks thought she was just crazy. Margaret's mind raced. Who was this Mrs. Carter? Why would she take in 3 lost boys? She knew she had to find her if she was still alive. She asked Ruth for directions, and Ruth scribbled them down on a napkin, her hand shaking slightly. As Margaret left the diner, she noticed a man standing across the street, watching her intently. He was tall, dressed in worn jeans and a flannel jacket, and he didn't look away when she caught his gaze. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. She hurried back to her car and drove out of town, following the directions Ruth had given her. The road to Mrs. Carter's house was little more than a dirt trail, winding up into the hills. The forest pressed in close on either side, the towering redwoods blocking out the morning sun. Margaret's car bounced and jolted over the ruts in the road, but she didn't care. She had to find this woman. When she finally reached the house, she was taken aback by how isolated it was. The small cabin was old and weathered, with peeling paint and a sagging porch. An overgrown garden lay in front, choked with weeds. She climbed the creaking steps and knocked on the door, holding her breath. After a long moment, the door swung open. A woman stood there, her white hair pulled back in a tight bun. Her eyes were sharp and clear, and Margaret felt an uneasy sensation under that steady gaze. "Can I help you?" the woman asked. Margaret held up the photo. "I'm looking for my sons. I was told they lived here once." The woman studied the photo, her expression unreadable. "Come inside," she said finally, stepping back to let Margaret in. The cabin smelled of herbs and smoke, and strange trinkets hung from the ceiling: feathers, bits of bone, tiny glass bottles filled with dark liquid. Margaret felt like she'd stepped into another world. Mrs. Carter led her to a small table and poured her a cup of tea. "You're Margaret," she said softly, not a question but a statement. "I've been expecting you." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. "You knew I was coming?" Mrs. Carter nodded. "The past has a way of catching up to the present. Your boys, they stayed here for a while. They were frightened, always looking for something or someone, but they wouldn't talk about it. I did what I could to keep them safe." "Where did they go?" Margaret asked, her voice trembling. "Why did they leave?" Mrs. Carter sighed, her eyes distant. "One night, they were just gone. I don't know how or why, but I've always believed Redwood Creek took them, in its own way. This place, it holds on to things. Secrets. Memories. It doesn't let go easily." Margaret felt a surge of frustration. "What does that mean? Redwood Creek took them? Are they alive?" Mrs. Carter's gaze grew sad. "I don't know, child. I wish I did. But I do know this. There's something old in these woods, something that doesn't like outsiders poking around. Be careful, Margaret. Not everyone here wants the truth to come out." Margaret left the cabin feeling more determined than ever. She knew now that her boys had been here, that they'd lived with this woman and then vanished again. But what had driven them away? And what did Mrs. Carter mean about something old in the woods? She decided to head back into town, hoping to find more answers. But as she drove down the twisting road, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being followed. Every time she glanced in the rearview mirror, she half expected to see that man in the flannel jacket or some shadowy figure among the trees. At the edge of town, she stopped at the general store to buy supplies. The man behind the counter barely looked at her, his face hard and closed off. When she asked if he knew anything about the triplets, he just shook his head and muttered, "Best to leave old ghosts alone." That night, Margaret went for a walk through the woods near the motel. She needed to clear her head, to think. The forest was dense and silent, the air thick with mist. She walked carefully, her flashlight cutting through the darkness. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves made her jump. She could almost hear whispers in the shadows, soft voices calling her name. Suddenly, she stumbled across an old wooden sign, half buried in moss. The same sign from the photo, "Welcome to Redwood Creek." Her breath caught in her throat. She was standing in the exact spot where the picture had been taken. She looked around, trying to imagine her boys here, standing where she stood now. It felt like the past and present were colliding. A sudden noise behind her made her spin around, heart racing. But there was nothing there, just the darkness of the woods pressing in. She turned back to the sign and noticed something she hadn't seen before, initials carved into the wood. J, L, and M. Her boys' initials. It was like they'd left a message for her, a sign they'd been here. Margaret felt a surge of hope and a fresh wave of fear. She knew she was getting close to the truth. But what would she find if she kept digging? And would Redwood Creek ever let her leave if she did? As she stood there, clutching the photo to her chest, she knew one thing for sure. She couldn't turn back now. She had to know what had happened to her boys, no matter what it cost her. Margaret couldn't shake the chill she felt standing there by the old sign. The initials, carved so long ago, seemed to glow in the moonlight, whispering promises of answers she had waited decades to hear. She touched the worn wood gently, her fingers tracing each letter. J, L, and M, James, Liam, and Michael. Her triplets. It felt like a sign from the universe, but also a warning. She hurried back to the motel, her mind racing. She didn't sleep that night, the image of the initials and the sound of the forest filling her thoughts. She needed more information, and she knew she couldn't rely on the townspeople. Most of them were too scared or too secretive. She decided to call an old friend, someone she trusted completely, her sister, Claire. Claire lived a few hours away, and Margaret hadn't seen her in years. She dialed her number, her hands shaking. When Claire answered, her voice was warm and familiar, and Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. She quickly explained everything she had learned, the photo, the old woman, the initials in the forest. Claire listened without interrupting, her silence a comfort. "Margaret," Claire said softly, "I'll come to Redwood Creek. You shouldn't be there alone." And just like that, Margaret felt a flicker of hope again. The next afternoon, Claire arrived in town, her car covered in dust from the long drive. She hugged Margaret tight, the kind of hug that makes you feel like maybe everything will be okay. They sat together in the motel room, the photos spread out on the table between them. "You've always been stubborn," Claire said with a smile. "I'm not surprised you found something the police never could." Margaret smiled back, though her eyes were tired. "I just want my boys back," she said quietly. They decided to visit Mrs. Carter again, hoping that with Claire there, the old woman might share more. But when they arrived at the cabin, the place was empty. The door hung open slightly, creaking in the breeze. Inside, the rooms were stripped bare. No trinkets, no herbs, no sign of the woman at all. It was like she had never been there. Claire frowned. "This doesn't feel right," she said. "It's like she vanished overnight." Margaret's gut twisted. What if Mrs. Carter was taken, just like her boys? Or what if she had fled, scared of what she knew? They searched the cabin for any clue. In a small back room, Margaret found a dusty journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. She opened it and scanned the pages, the handwriting tight and hurried. It spoke of the forest, of strange figures seen at night, of voices in the darkness that called out names. It was filled with half-crazed warnings, the woods remember, and they never really leave. Claire looked worried as she read over Margaret's shoulder. "This is unsettling," she said softly. Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. She tucked the journal into her bag. It might be the only link she had to what had really happened. Back in town, they went to the diner again, hoping to see Ruth. But Ruth was gone, and the diner's closed sign hung in the window. Margaret felt the walls of Redwood Creek closing in around her. It was as if the town itself was trying to push her out. That night, she dreamed of the boys. In her dream, they were standing in the forest, their faces pale and their eyes wide with fear. They were calling her name, their voices echoing through the trees. She woke up gasping, her heart hammering in her chest. The next morning, she and Claire decided to visit the local library, hoping to find old newspapers or records that might mention the triplets. The librarian was a thin, nervous man who watched them carefully as they pored over dusty archives. They found articles about missing hikers, old accidents in the woods, but nothing about the triplets. It was like the town had erased them from history. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, they decided to take another look at the forest. They packed food and flashlights, and as they stepped under the heavy canopy of trees, Margaret felt like she was stepping into another world. The air was cool and still, the forest floor soft with moss. Every so often, she thought she heard footsteps behind them, but when she turned, there was nothing there. Claire was the one who noticed it first, a small path leading deeper into the trees, hidden behind a fallen log. They followed it, their steps careful and quiet. The path twisted and turned, and soon they found themselves at a clearing they hadn't seen before. In the center was a stone circle, old and covered in moss. Margaret's breath caught. It looked ancient, older than the town itself. "What is this place?" Claire whispered. Margaret shook her head, but she felt it in her bones. This was important. Around the circle, the trees were twisted, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. Margaret stepped forward, feeling a strange energy in the air. She knelt and brushed away the moss on one of the stones, revealing more initials carved deep into the surface. But these were different, unfamiliar. Names she didn't recognize. "It's like a marker," Claire said, her voice trembling. "For all the people who've disappeared." Margaret felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She looked around the clearing, feeling the weight of all the lost souls who might be buried in this place. She whispered a quiet promise to her boys she wouldn't stop looking, not now, not ever. As they made their way back to town, the forest seemed to close in tighter around them. Margaret kept thinking about Mrs. Carter's words, about something old in the woods that didn't want to be disturbed. What was it? A secret the town was hiding? Something supernatural? She didn't know, but she could feel it getting closer. That evening, back in the motel, Claire suggested they talk to the man they'd seen watching Margaret, the one in the flannel jacket. He seemed to know more than he let on, and Margaret knew they had to try. They found him at the edge of town, leaning against an old pickup truck, his eyes wary but not unkind. Margaret took a deep breath and walked up to him. "I think you know something about my sons," she said quietly. The man looked at her for a long moment, then sighed. "I remember them," he said finally. "I was just a kid, but I remember the triplets. They were always together, always looking over their shoulders like something was after them. Then one night, they were gone, and everyone just stopped talking about it." Margaret swallowed hard. "Do you know what happened to them?" "Please, I need to know." He hesitated, glancing at the darkening woods behind him. "There are things out there, ma'am," he said slowly. "Things that don't belong in this world. Redwood Creek, it's not just a town. It's a place that keeps secrets. And those secrets don't like the light." Margaret felt a surge of both fear and determination. She had come too far to turn back now. As she and Claire walked back to the motel in the fading light, the forest seemed to whisper around them. The answers she was looking for felt closer than ever, but so did the danger. Margaret didn't know what she would find next, but she knew one thing for certain. She wouldn't stop until she found the truth. And maybe, just maybe, she'd bring her boys home again. Margaret barely slept that night. The man's words echoed in her mind. Things that don't belong in this world. Redwood Creek was no ordinary place, she realized. It was as if the forest itself had been keeping her boys prisoner all these years, hiding them away in its shadows. She lay in bed, staring at the water-stained ceiling, the quiet hum of the motel sign outside her window like a heartbeat in the darkness. Claire was awake too, sitting in the chair by the window and watching the night. "Do you believe him?" she asked quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. Margaret nodded. "I don't know what's out there, but I know my boys are, or were part of it. And I can't stop now, Claire. I'm closer than I've ever been." They decided to go back to the stone circle at first light. Margaret felt drawn there, as if the forest itself was guiding her. She packed the journal she'd found at Mrs. Carter's, along with the photo and a flashlight. Claire checked her phone. No signal, of course. Redwood Creek seemed to swallow up anything that tried to connect it to the outside world. As they left the motel, the early morning mist hung low over the town, thick and damp. The trees loomed overhead, their twisted branches reaching out like claws. Margaret felt the weight of them pressing down, but she refused to be afraid. She had come here for her boys, and she wouldn't leave without them. The path to the clearing was even harder to find in the pale dawn light, but Margaret felt her way forward, driven by something deep in her heart. The forest was almost too quiet. The usual sounds of birds and insects were replaced by an eerie stillness. Every step felt like it echoed. When they reached the circle of stones, Margaret felt her breath catch. In the soft light, the stones seemed to glow faintly, the initials on their surfaces clearer than before. She knelt down, tracing her fingers over the cold, damp rock. "J, L, and M," she whispered. "I know you're out there." Claire stood watch, her eyes scanning the shadows. "What are you looking for, Margaret?" she asked softly. "I don't know," Margaret said, "but I can feel them here, like they're trying to reach me." She took out Mrs. Carter's journal and flipped through it, looking for something, anything, that might make sense of what was happening. One entry caught her eye. "The forest keeps what it wants, but the lost can be called back if you know how to listen." Margaret closed her eyes, listening. She let the forest sounds fill her, the wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves. And then she heard it, a faint echo, like children laughing far away. She stood up, her heart racing. "Do you hear that?" she asked Claire. Claire shook her head. "What is it?" "Voices," Margaret said, her voice trembling. I think it's them." She turned in a slow circle, trying to follow the sound. It led her deeper into the woods, away from the circle. Claire hesitated, then followed her sister, her hand tied on Margaret's shoulder. They walked for what felt like hours, though the light never seemed to change. The forest grew denser, the undergrowth thicker, but Margaret pushed on. The laughter grew clearer, like a melody she'd known in another life. Then, the forest opened up into a hidden glade. In the center stood a huge oak tree, its trunk gnarled and ancient. The air around it felt electric, almost humming. Margaret stepped closer, her breath catching. Carved into the bark were more initials, dozens of them, old and new, overlapping in a chaotic tangle. Claire shivered. "It's like a graveyard," she whispered. Margaret reached out to touch the tree. The bark was warm under her fingers, pulsing faintly. She felt a rush of memories, birthdays and laughter, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. She saw her boys as they'd been, the way she remembered them. And then she saw them as they were now older, haunted, hiding in the shadows of the forest. A voice behind her made her jump. "You shouldn't be here." She spun around to see the man in the flannel jacket again, standing at the edge of the glade. His eyes were wide and fearful. "You don't understand what you're dealing with." Margaret took a step back, but she didn't lower her gaze. "Tell me," she demanded. "Tell me what this place is." The man sighed. "This forest, it's alive. It's old, older than Redwood Creek, older than any of us. It feeds on secrets and pain. Your boys, they became part of it when they disappeared. If you're not careful, you will too." Claire looked at him, her face pale. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the tree. "The initials, the voices, it's how the forest keeps them. You can't just take them back. It doesn't let go." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "But they're my sons. I have to try." The man's face softened. "I know, but you need to be careful. If you wake whatever's in this place, you might lose yourself too." Margaret turned back to the tree, her mind spinning. She didn't know how to fight a forest, but she knew she couldn't leave her boys behind. She pressed her hand against the bark again, her voice trembling. "James, Liam, Michael. I'm here. I'm not leaving without you." The wind picked up suddenly, whipping through the glade. The branches of the oak shivered, and Margaret thought she saw shapes in the mist, small figures, moving just out of sight. She felt them, the triplets, so close she could almost touch them. Claire grabbed her arm. "Margaret, we need to go. This isn't safe." Margaret shook her head. "I can't. Not yet." The man in the flannel jacket stepped forward. "If you're going to stay, you need to know what you're up against," he said. He pulled a small wooden box from his pocket and handed it to her. "This belonged to Mrs. Carter. She said it was the only thing that could break the forest hold." Margaret took the box, her hands trembling. Inside was a small, carved figurine, a mother holding 3 children close. It was worn smooth from years of handling. Margaret felt a surge of hope and fear. "What do I do with it?" she asked. "Keep it with you," he said. "It's a token of protection. But be careful, the forest will fight back." Margaret nodded, clutching the figurine tight. She turned back to the tree, the wind roaring around her. She could feel the forest's power pressing in, the shadows growing darker. She knew she was standing at the edge of something ancient and dangerous, and she was ready to face it. She closed her eyes and called out again, louder this time. "James, Liam, Michael, come back to me." Her voice echoed through the glade, swallowed by the mist. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then she heard it, a soft voice, calling her name. Margaret opened her eyes, and in the shifting fog, she saw 3 figures. They were older than she remembered, their faces drawn and pale, but she knew them instantly. Her heart leapt in her chest, tears streaming down her face. But before she could move, the wind howled louder, and the figures blurred and vanished into the trees. Margaret fell to her knees, clutching the figurine to her chest. She could still feel them there, so close, and yet so far. The man in the flannel jacket laid a hand on her shoulder. "You're almost there," he said softly. "But the forest isn't done with you yet." Margaret knew he was right. The battle was just beginning, and she would fight for her boys, for the truth, and for the chance to bring them home again. Margaret gripped the small figurine so tightly it left an imprint on her palm. The wind had stilled as quickly as it had risen, leaving a deep, heavy silence in its wake. The man in the flannel jacket gave her a somber nod, then disappeared back into the forest without another word. Margaret watched him go, a swirl of fear and determination twisting in her chest. Claire knelt beside her, her face pale, her eyes wide. "Margaret," she whispered, "I saw them too. It was them, but they looked so lost." Margaret nodded slowly, swallowing hard. "I know," she said, her voice hoarse. "They're trapped. And the forest, it's holding on to them, somehow. But I'm not giving up." As they made their way back to the motel, the forest seemed almost alive, branches shifting above them in a silent warning. The tension in the air was thick, and Margaret knew that whatever she had stirred was only beginning. She clutched the figurine, feeling its warmth, drawing strength from it. She had no idea how to break the forest's hold, but she was ready to try. Back at the motel, the desk clerk watched them curiously as they came in, his eyes flicking to the muddy tracks they left behind. Margaret ignored him, pulling Claire into their room and locking the door behind them. She spread out the journal, the photo, and the figurine on the bed, trying to make sense of it all. "Margaret," Claire said, her voice shaking, "what if this is too much for us? What if the forest, it doesn't want them to leave?" Margaret looked up at her sister, her expression fierce. "Then we'll make it let them go," she said. "I'm not leaving without my boys, Claire. I can feel them. They're still here, somewhere." Claire hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Whatever happens, I'm with you." As the night crept in around them, Margaret found herself thinking of the triplets as they'd been. Their laughter, their endless curiosity, the way they had always stuck together. She thought of the stories they'd loved to hear about the forest, the legends of spirits and lost souls, of whispers in the dark. She never believed those stories would come back to haunt her. The next morning, Margaret woke with a sense of urgency. She knew she had to return to the glade, but she also knew she needed more answers first. She decided to visit the town's historical society, hoping to find old maps or records that might explain the forest hold. The historical society was housed in an old brick building at the edge of town. Inside, it smelled of dust and old paper, the air thick with the scent of forgotten memories. Margaret explained what she was looking for to the elderly curator, a woman named Martha who wore thick glasses and moved slowly but with purpose. "I've lived in Redwood Creek my whole life," Martha said. "This forest, it's always been a part of us. People used to say it was sacred, that it was alive. But over the years, those stories were buried. No one wanted to remember." Margaret nodded. "I think my boys are trapped in there. I need to know how to reach them." Martha looked at her carefully, then sighed. She led Margaret and Claire to a back room, filled with old ledgers and faded maps. "There was a family here, long ago," Martha said softly. "The Holloways. They were said to be protectors of the forest. They knew its secrets. But their line died out, or so people thought." Margaret's breath caught. "Holloways." Martha nodded. Mrs. Carter was one of them. She was the last. If anyone knew how to speak to the forest, it was her. Margaret pulled out the figurine. "She left me this. Do you know what it means?" Martha's eyes widened. "That's a mother's totem. The Holloways used them to call back the lost. But the forest doesn't give back easily. If you use it, you have to be ready to face whatever it hides." Margaret clutched the figurine tighter. She thanked Martha and left, her mind racing. The Holloways, protectors of the forest. Mrs. Carter had known something that could help her save her boys. As they left the historical society, Claire stopped suddenly, her hand gripping Margaret's arm. "Look," she said, pointing across the street. There, standing in the doorway of an abandoned shop, was the woman from the diner, Ruth. But something was different. Her face was pale, her eyes hollow. Margaret ran across the street, calling out. Ruth didn't move, just watched her with a distant, empty gaze. "Ruth," Margaret said, her voice urgent, "what happened to my sons?" Ruth's lips moved soundlessly at first, then she spoke in a voice that sounded too old, too tired. "They're close, but the forest, it won't let them go. It needs them. And if you take them back, it will take something else in return." Margaret felt her heart lurch. "What does that mean?" she demanded. Ruth didn't answer. She turned and vanished into the darkness of the shop, the door slamming shut behind her. Margaret tried to open it, but it was locked tight. Claire pulled her back, her eyes wide with fear. "Margaret, this is getting worse." Margaret knew she was right. The forest wasn't just alive, it was hungry. It had taken her boys, and if she wasn't careful, it would take her too. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat by the window, the figurine in her hand, and watched the trees sway in the darkness. She thought of Ruth's warning, it will take something else in return. Was she ready for that? Could she sacrifice something or someone to save her sons? As dawn crept over Redwood Creek, Margaret felt a fierce resolve hardening in her chest. She was ready. She and Claire would go back to the oak tree, to the glade. She would use the totem, call her boys back, and face whatever the forest threw at her. As they made their way into the forest one last time, the air felt charged, the mist thicker than ever. Every step was a struggle, but Margaret didn't falter. Claire stayed close, her flashlight cutting through the gloom. They reached the glade, and the oak tree loomed above them like a silent judge. Margaret knelt before it, the figurine cradled in her hands. She took a deep breath and began to whisper their names. "James, Liam, Michael, come back to me." The wind picked up, the branches creaking and groaning. The mist swirled around them, shapes moving in its depths. Margaret felt the forest's power pressing in, testing her. She held the totem high, her voice trembling but sure. "I call you back. I call you home." For a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ground beneath her shuddered, and the mist parted. 3 figures emerged, their outlines flickering like candle flames. Her boys. They stood there, older, haunted, but real. But as they stepped forward, a shape moved behind them. Something massive, shadowy, with eyes that glowed like embers. Margaret's breath caught. She realized then what Ruth had meant. The forest wouldn't let them go without a fight, and she would have to face whatever darkness had claimed them. The wind howled, the forest groaned, and Margaret rose to her feet, her heart pounding. She was ready. This was the moment she had been waiting for, the moment she would bring her boys home, or lose herself forever. The forest held its breath, the final showdown waiting in the shadows. Margaret's pulse thundered in her ears as the boys stepped into the clearing. James, Liam, and Michael, their faces older, eyes shadowed but unmistakably hers. Tears spilled down her cheeks, a surge of relief crashing through her. She took a step forward, arms outstretched, but the forest seemed to draw in a deep breath. The towering oak's branches rattled, and the wind turned sharp, hissing through the clearing like an angry whisper. She saw the dark figure in the mist, looming behind her boys. Its eyes burned red, shifting like coals in the darkness. It was more than just a shadow. It was the forest itself, the embodiment of everything that had held them captive. Margaret's hand tightened around the figurine. She took a breath and forced her voice to stay steady. "James, Liam, Michael, come to me," she said, her voice slicing through the roar of the wind. "I'm here. I've come for you." The boys looked at her, their expressions a mix of hope and fear. They took hesitant steps forward, but the shadow flared around them, coiling tighter. It seemed to roar without a sound, and the ground trembled beneath Margaret's feet. She felt the forest's anger, its hunger. It wanted to keep her boys, to keep them forever. But she wouldn't let it. She pressed the figurine to her chest and closed her eyes, focusing all her love, all her memories of her boys. She spoke their names again, her voice full of everything she had carried for 30 years. "I remember your first steps, your laughter, your tears. I remember everything, and I will not let you go." The figurine glowed faintly in her hand, a soft warmth that spread through her chest. She opened her eyes, and the boys were closer now. James reached out, his fingers brushing hers. She could feel the chill of the forest trying to pull him back, but she held on. The shadow behind them shrieked in the wind, the trees shaking and groaning. The forest seemed to scream, a sound that vibrated in Margaret's bones. Claire called out, her voice tight with fear. "Margaret, be careful." Margaret ignored the terror clawing at her. She focused on her sons, their faces so close. "I love you," she whispered. "Come back to me." For a moment, time seemed to stop. The forest's roar faded, replaced by a sudden, eerie stillness. The boys' eyes cleared, their faces softening. Michael reached out, his hand warm against hers. Liam's lips trembled into a small smile. And James nodded once, his eyes full of something she hadn't seen in years, hope. But as they stepped forward, the shadow lunged, wrapping around them like black smoke. Margaret's heart clenched. She screamed their names, and the figurine flared with a sudden, blinding light. The shadow recoiled, its shape twisting and shuddering in the light. Margaret felt the forest's power surge against her, a final desperate push to keep what it had taken. She dug her heels into the earth, holding tight to the figurine and to her boys' hands. "I won't let you have them," she shouted, her voice breaking but fierce. "They are mine, they are mine." The forest seemed to howl in pain. The light from the figurine pulsed brighter, flooding the clearing with a warm, golden glow. The shadows dissolved like mist in the sun, and the boys stumbled forward, free at last. Margaret caught them in her arms, her tears flowing freely. She pressed her face to their shoulders, breathing them in. "I've got you," she sobbed. "I've got you now." The forest was silent, the darkness lifting as the light from the figurine spread outward, pushing back the mist and the cold. The towering oak groaned one last time, then fell still. Margaret held her boys close, their bodies solid and real against her. For a long moment, everything was quiet. Then James spoke, his voice soft and shaking. "Mom, we heard you. We've been waiting for so long." She pulled back just enough to see his face, her heart breaking and healing all at once. "I know, baby," she whispered. "I know." Claire knelt beside them, her own tears glistening. "You did it," she said, her voice full of awe. "You brought them back." Margaret nodded, her hands trembling. "I didn't do it alone," she said. "We did this together." The boys looked around the clearing, the forest no longer pressing in on them. The light from the figurine had faded, but it still felt warm in Margaret's pocket. She knew they were safe now. She could feel it in her bones. But just as relief washed over her, she noticed something. The forest was still. Too still. She turned, and the clearing seemed to ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. In the distance, she saw Ruth standing at the edge of the trees, her eyes dark and knowing. Margaret stood, her boys clinging to her. "What is it?" she asked. Ruth's voice was soft, but it carried across the clearing. "The forest gives back what it takes," she said. "But it always demands a price." Margaret's heart froze. She looked down at her boys, then back at Ruth. "What price?" she demanded. Ruth didn't answer. She simply turned and vanished into the trees, leaving Margaret with a cold dread pooling in her stomach. Claire squeezed her shoulder. "We should go," she said quietly. "Let's get out of here." Margaret nodded, gathering her boys close. They left the clearing together, the forest strangely quiet around them. As they walked, the trees seemed to lean in, watching, but they didn't try to stop them. By the time they reached the edge of Redwood Creek, the sky was bright and clear. The town looked the same as it always had, but Margaret knew nothing would ever be the same for them again. They found the old motel and packed up quickly. Claire kept glancing back at the forest, her face tight with worry. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked. Margaret looked at her sons, at the way they held each other's hands, the way they clung to her. "I don't know," she said honestly, "but we have each other now. That's what matters." As they loaded up the car, Michael paused, his face pale. "Mom," he said softly, "when we were in the forest, it said it wouldn't let us go. That it would come for you instead." Margaret felt her breath catch. She forced a smile, brushing his hair back from his face. "It doesn't matter," she said. "I have you. That's all I need." But as they drove away from Redwood Creek, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that the forest wasn't finished. In the rearview mirror, she saw the trees receding into the distance, but they seemed to whisper her name one last time. And as they turned onto the highway, she realized something chilling. The figurine in her pocket was warm again, pulsing softly against her skin. The forest might have let her boys go, but it had left a part of itself behind. Margaret didn't know what it meant, or what price she would have to pay. But she knew this. She had her sons, and she would fight for them as long as she had breath in her body. And deep in the forest, the shadows shifted and waited, already planning their next move. As Margaret drove away from Redwood Creek, she felt the weight of the past 30 years shifting on her shoulders, no longer just a burden, but a story she had survived. Her boys sat in the back seat, pressed close together, whispering softly to each other. Claire rode beside her, her expression thoughtful, watching the forest fade into the rearview mirror. The sky overhead was washed with gold as the sun began to set, and Margaret couldn't help but wonder if that was a sign that the darkness was finally behind them. The drive was quiet at first, everyone lost in their own thoughts. Margaret kept her eyes on the road, but her mind wandered back to the final moment in the forest, the way the figurine had glowed, the way her boys had stepped free. She touched the totem in her pocket, feeling its warmth still there, though it no longer pulsed with that urgent light. Whatever magic had once held them captive was gone now, but the forest had left its mark on them all. "Mom," James said from the back seat, breaking the silence. Do you think it will ever come back?" She took a moment to answer, choosing her words carefully. "I don't know, sweetheart. But I do know that whatever happens, we'll face it together. You're home now. That's what matters." Liam squeezed Michael's hand, and Michael managed a small smile. Claire looked over at Margaret, her gaze steady. "We'll figure it out," she said. "We always do." They stopped in the next town for the night, taking 2 rooms at a small roadside inn. Margaret let the boys choose the beds, letting them have that simple comfort after so many years of loss. She sat by the window as they settled in, listening to the faint sounds of traffic and the hum of the motel's old neon sign. The forest was far behind them, but she knew its memory would linger like a shadow for a long time. After the boys fell asleep, Margaret stepped outside for some air. The night was cool and calm, the stars bright overhead. Claire joined her, leaning against the railing. "It's really over, isn't it?" she asked quietly. Margaret nodded. "I think so. But it changed us. I can feel it in my bones." Claire sighed. "We'll heal, Margaret. You found them. That's what matters most." Margaret smiled faintly. "You're right. I keep thinking about what Ruth said. About the forest wanting something in return." Claire shook her head firmly. "Don't let it haunt you. Whatever it wanted, it didn't take you. You're still here, and your boys are too." Margaret drew a deep breath, feeling the weight of that truth. "I know, and I'm grateful. I just hope they can find some peace now." They stood there a while longer, watching the sky. Margaret thought about how much she'd lost, but also about how much she'd found, the strength to keep going, the love that had anchored her even when everything else had fallen away. She knew the forest might still whisper to her in her dreams, but she also knew she was stronger than it had ever imagined. The next morning, they packed up early, the boys quiet but calm. As they drove away from the motel, James turned to Margaret, his eyes serious. "Mom, do you think we'll ever forget it? What happened to us in there?" Margaret reached back to squeeze his hand. "You'll never forget," she said honestly, "but you'll learn how to live with it. You'll learn how to take the pain and turn it into something stronger. And I'll be right here to help you." Michael looked out the window, his expression softening. "I'm just glad we're together," he said. "That's all that matters to me." Margaret smiled at that, her heart swelling with pride. "Me too," she said. "That's all I ever wanted." They drove for hours, finally reaching the edge of the county where Redwood Creek had once seemed like the only place that mattered. Now, it felt smaller somehow, just a part of a bigger world they were finally ready to step back into. Margaret knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be nightmares. There would be questions. But they would face it all as a family. They stopped for lunch at a diner along the highway, the kind of place where the coffee was hot and the pie was homemade. The boys ate quietly, but their eyes were brighter than Margaret had seen in years. Claire kept glancing at them, as if she still couldn't believe they were real. Margaret understood. She felt the same, a mix of relief and wonder, like waking up from a dream she'd been trapped in too long. When they got back on the road, Margaret found herself thinking about the forest one last time. She wondered if it would ever let go of the part of her that had been swallowed by its darkness. But then she looked at her sons in the back seat, and she knew that it didn't matter. The forest had tried to keep them, but it hadn't won. Love had won. Family had won. They reached home as the sun was setting, the house looking just as she'd left it, a little worn, but still full of memories. Margaret felt a surge of gratitude as she unlocked the door and let her boys step inside. The smell of home wrapped around them, familiar and warm. The boys wandered from room to room, touching old toys and framed photos, their eyes wide with wonder. Claire helped Margaret unpack, the two of them sharing small smiles as they watched the boys settle back in. Later, they sat in the living room, the glow of a single lamp washing the room in soft light. Michael fell asleep on the couch, and Liam leaned against Margaret's shoulder, his breathing slow and even. James stayed up, watching the flames flicker in the old fireplace. After a while, he spoke, his voice quiet. "Mom, what happens now?" Margaret thought about it, then took his hand in hers. "Now, we start again," she said. "We heal. We laugh. We remember. And we make new memories. That's how we move forward." He nodded, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "I like that," he said softly. Margaret brushed his hair back, her heart full. "Me too, baby. Me too." As the night grew deeper, Margaret felt a quiet peace settle around her. The forest was behind them. The darkness was done. She didn't know what the future would bring, but she knew they would face it together, and that was enough. And in the quiet of the night, as the last echoes of the forest faded from her mind, Margaret made herself a promise. She would never forget what the forest had tried to take. She would never let the darkness steal her hope again. Because in the end, love was the strongest magic of all, and she had found her boys. She had brought them home. That was her truth. That was her victory. And as she closed her eyes, holding her boys close, She knew that no shadow could ever take that away from her.